A boy was born in a family where there was no tradition of education, and in his city, children were taught only that they should learn to do calculations. In his city, education had no meaning except to earn money, but this boy was a born revolutionary. He rebelled against his family and took admission in high school, where he read many theoretical philosophers and evolutionists and was so influenced by them that he started a revolution in his entire country, or a revolution that changed China forever. This boy's name was Mao Zedong. He gave birth to the communist thought in China and at the same time established the communist government in China forever, which is still in power in China. But in his radical reforms and attempt to make China an industrial power, Mao became a brutal dictator and put millions to death. You will be surprised to know that more than 45 million innocent people were killed during Mao's regime from 1958 to 1962 due to the crit-lag forward policy. Mao Zedong is like two sides of a coin where everyone only sees him from his side. Let's know who Mao Zedong really was and how he changed China completely. And you will also know in which relationships he was trapped in his personal life. Everything within China can change, and what laws Mao Zedong implemented cannot change. Early life. Youth and the Xinhai Revolution, 1893 to 1911. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, at Shaoshan village in Hunan. His father, Mao Yichang, was a once destitute peasant who had become one of Shaoshan's wealthiest farmers. Growing up in rural Hunan, Mao characterized his father as a strict disciplinarian who beat him and his three brothers, the boys Zemin and Zayton, as well as an adoptive sister/cousin named Zijian. Wen Qimei, Mao's mother, was a devoted Buddhist who attempted to soften her husband's stern attitude. Mao, too, became a Buddhist, but he abandoned the faith in his mid-teens. Mao began attending Shaoshan Primary School when he was 8 years old. Learning Confucianism's value systems, he subsequently acknowledged that he disliked classical Chinese works espousing Confucian ideals, preferring classic novels such as Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin. At the age of 13, Mao completed primary school, and his father arranged for him to marry the 17-year-old Luo Yishou, bringing two landowning families together. Mao refused to acknowledge her as his wife, becoming a staunch opponent of arranged marriages and temporarily relocating. Luo was shamed in his community and died at the age of 20 in 1910. While working on his father's farm, Mao read voraciously and gained political consciousness from Zheng Guanyi's booklet, which bemoaned the decline of Chinese authority and advocated for the implementation of representative democracy. Mao also read translated books by Western authors such as Adam Smith, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Charles Darwin, and Thomas Huxley. 34 Mao, a history buff, was inspired by George Washington's military prowess and Napoleon Bonaparte's nationalistic enthusiasm. His political ideas were formed by Zhelaohui-led riots in Changsha, Hunan's capital, in response to a famine. Mao supported the demonstrators' demands, but the armed forces suppressed them and murdered their leaders. The famine extended to Shaoshan, and starving peasants took his father's food. He condemned their conduct as ethically wrong, but expressed sympathy for their plight. At 16, Mao transferred to a higher primary school in nearby Dongshan, where he was ridiculed because of his peasant origins. In 1911, Mao started middle school in Changsha. Revolutionary sentiment was prevalent in the city, where there was considerable opposition to Emperor Puyi's absolute monarchy, and many people advocated republicanism. Sun Yat-sen, an American-educated Christian who led the Tongmenghui Society, served as the Republican's symbol. Mao was influenced by Sun's newspaper, The People's Independence, Minli Bao, and in a school essay, he advocated for Sun to become president. Mao and a buddy chopped off their queue pigtails as a gesture of rebellion against the Manchu monarch, which represented subservience to the emperor. Inspired by Sun's republicanism, the soldiers rose up in southern China, igniting the Xinhai Revolution. Changsha's governor left, leaving the city under republican rule. Mao supported the revolution and joined the rebel army as a private soldier, but he did not participate in battle or warfare. The northern provinces remained faithful to the emperor, and in order to avert civil war, Sun, proclaimed provisional president by his supporters, made a deal with the monarchist general Yuan Shikai. The monarchy was abolished, resulting in the Republic of China, but Yuan, a monarchist, became president. Mao withdrew from the army in 1912, 6 months after the revolution had ended. Around this time, Mao discovered socialism through a newspaper story. After reading pamphlets by Jiang Kanghu, the student founder of the Chinese Socialist Party, Mao remained interested but unimpressed by the concept. Changsha's Fourth Normal School, 1912 to 1919. Over the next few years, Mao Zedong attended and dropped out of a police academy, a soap-making school, a law school, an economics school, and the government-run Changsha Middle School. While studying independently, he spent a lot of time at Changsha's library, reading essential works of classical liberalism including Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, as well as books by Western scientists and philosophers like Darwin, Mill, Rousseau, and Spencer. Years later, he stated that he considered himself to be superior to working people while viewing himself as an intellectual. He was influenced by Friedrich Paulsen, a neo-Kantian philosopher. Mao, an educator whose emphasis on achieving a clearly defined objective as the ultimate value, came to feel that powerful people were not bound by moral rules but should strive for a great purpose. His father found no point in his son's intellectual aspirations, so he took away his allowance and forced him to live in a homeless hostel. Mao aspired to be a teacher and enrolled in the Fourth Normal School of Changsha, which later merged with the First Normal School of Hunan, widely regarded as the best in Hunan. Professor Yang Changji, who befriended Mao, persuaded him to read the radical publication New Youth, Xin Qingnian, which was founded by his friend Chen Duxiu, a dean at Peking University. Although he supported Chinese nationalism, Chen believed that China needed to look to the West to rid itself of superstition and authoritarianism. In his first year of school, Mao befriended an older student, Xiao Zisheng, and they embarked on a walking tour of Hunan, begging and creating literary couplets to buy food. In 1915, Mao, a popular student, was elected secretary of the Students' Society. He founded the Association for Student Self-Government and spearheaded rallies against school policies. In April 1917, Mao published his first article in New Youth, advising readers to build physical strength to serve the revolution. He joined the Society for the Study of Wang Fuji, Chuanshan Sushi, a revolutionary organization created by Changsha literati seeking to emulate philosopher Wang Fuji. In spring 1917, he was voted to lead the Students' Volunteer Army, which was formed to defend the school against marauding soldiers. He became increasingly interested in military strategies and took an active role in world military, as well as developing a sense of solidarity with workers. Mao performed physical endurance feats with Xiao Zisheng and Kai Hussein, and in April 1918, he and other young revolutionaries created the renovation of the People's Study Society to debate Chen Duxiu's theories. Desiring personal and societal transformation, the society attracted 70 to 80 members, many of whom ultimately joined the Communist Party. Mao graduated in June 1919, ranking third for the year. Early revolutionary activity. Beijing, Anarchy, and Marxism, 1917 to 1919. Mao proceeded to Beijing, where his instructor, Yang Changji, had accepted a position at Peking University. Yang believed Mao was unusually intelligent and handsome, and hired him as an assistant to university librarian Li Dazhao, who would later become an early Chinese communist. Li wrote a series of New Youth essays about Russia's October Revolution, when the Communist Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, gained power. Lenin was an advocate of Marxism's socio-political theory, which was first created by German sociologists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and Li's works contributed Marxism to the Chinese revolutionary movement's ideas. Peter Kropotkin's anarchism, the most popular radical theory of the time, had a major influence on Mao before he became more and more radical. Chinese anarchists, like Peking University Chancellor Cai Yuanpei, advocated for a full social revolution in women's equality, family life, and social relations as opposed to the earlier revolutionaries' call for only a modification of the type of government. In the winter of 1919, he became involved in Li's study group and developed rapidly toward Marxism. Despite living in a small room with 7 other Hunanese students and receiving a meager salary, Mao said Beijing's natural beauty provided vivid and living compensation. Mao turned down the opportunity to study in France through the Mouvement Travail Etudes, an anarchist organized program, maybe due to his poor language skills, but Mao raised money for the movement. Mao was shunned by his peers at the university because of his lower status and accent from rural Hunan. He became a member of the philosophy and journalism societies at the university and went to seminars and lectures given by people like Qian Xiantong, Hu Shi, and Chen Duxiu. In the spring of 1919, Mao left Beijing to travel to Shanghai with companions who were getting ready to embark for France. His mother was dying in Shaoshan, therefore he chose not to go back there. Her husband passed away in January 1920, and she died in October 1919. 1919 to 1920, New Culture and Political Demonstrations. Students in Beijing assembled at Tiananmen on May 4, 1919, to demonstrate against the government of China's feeble efforts to thwart Japanese expansionism in the country. The influence that Japan was granted in the 1915-21 demands, the cooperation of the Beiyang administration under Duan Qirui, and the betrayal of China in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which led Japan to acquire Shandong regions that Germany had surrendered, infuriated the patriots. The countrywide May 4th movement and the New Culture movement, which attributed China's diplomatic setbacks to social and cultural regression, were sparked by these protests. Mao had started teaching history at the Xiuya Primary School in Changsha, and planning demonstrations against Zhang Jingyao, the pro-Duan governor of Hunan province who was dubbed Zhang the Venomous for his brutal and unscrupulous leadership. Together with He Shuheng and Deng Zhongxia, Mao co-founded the Hunanese Student Association in late May 1919. They planned a student walkout for June and started publishing the radical weekly publication Xiang River Review in July of that same year. He strengthened trade unions capable of waging non-violent revolution and promoted the idea of a great union of the popular masses, in language that the vast majority of Chinese people could understand. Though he was greatly influenced by Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid, his thoughts were not Marxist. Mao carried on publishing after taking over as editor of the liberal magazine New Hunan, Xin Hunan, and penning pieces in the well-known local newspaper Ta Kung Pao, despite Zhang's ban on the student association. Since Mao was inspired by his forced arranged marriage, a number of these promoted feminist ideas and called for the liberation of women in Chinese culture. Mao called a seminar in Changsha in the fall of 1919 to discuss political and economic concerns, as well as matters pertaining to Confucianism, methods of bringing the people together, and the viability of socialism. Mao established trade unions and night schools during this time, working with manual laborers on political fronts. Mao assisted in planning a nationwide walkout in Hunan in December 1919, which resulted in some concessions. However, Mao and other student leaders felt intimidated by Zhang, and Mao visited Yang Changji, who was near death, upon his return to Beijing. Upon seeing that his writings had gained some notoriety within the revolutionary movement, Mao began to ask for help in toppling Zhang. He became more and more influenced by the newly translated works of Marx and Engels, Karl Kautsky, Thomas Kirkup, and the Communist Manifesto, while his opinions remained diverse. Prior to relocating to Shanghai, where he worked as a laundryman and met Chen Duxiu, Mao traveled to Tianjin, Jinan, and Cifu. He wrote that Chen's conversion to Marxism deeply impressed me at what was probably a critical period in my life. Mao got to know Yi Peiji, an ex-teacher of his who was a revolutionary and a part of the Kuomintang, KMT, also known as the Chinese Nationalist Party, which was becoming more and more powerful. General Tan Yankai, a senior KMT member with the allegiance of troops positioned along the Hunanese border with Guangdong, was brought to Mao by Yi. Mao helped Tan in his effort to remove Zhang by putting the Changsha students in order. Zhang fled when Tan's army advanced into Changsha in June 1920. Mao was named headmaster of the junior division of the first normal school after the ensuing restructuring of the provincial government. In the winter of 1920, after he had become well off, he wed Yang Kaihui, Yang Changji's daughter. Chinese Communist Party founding, 1921 to 1922. In the Shanghai French concession, Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao established the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 as a study society and unofficial network. In addition to founding a branch of the Socialist Youth Corps and a cultural book society that built a bookstore to spread revolutionary literature throughout Hunan, Mao also established a branch in Changsha. In the hopes that a Hunanese constitution would expand civil liberties and facilitate his revolutionary activism, he participated in the drive for Hunan autonomy. Mao lost track of his role once the revolution was successful in installing provincial autonomy under a new warlord. Small Marxist organizations were active by 1921 in Wuhan, Guangzhou, Changsha, Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan and Jinan. A major gathering was scheduled to start on July 23, 1921, in Shanghai. Mao was one of the 13 delegates that attended the Chinese Communist Party's first National Congress session. The Congress delegates relocated to a boat on South Lake near Jiaxing, Zhejiang, in order to avoid being discovered after the authorities dispatched a police spy to the event. Despite the presence of Soviet and Comintern delegates, the First Congress stuck to the traditional Marxist view that only the urban proletariat could lead a socialist revolution, rejecting Lenin's advice to accept a temporary alliance between the communists and the bourgeois democrats, who also supported national revolution. Mao was Hunan's party secretary, based in Changsha, and he employed a number of strategies to grow the party there. He established the Self-Study University in August 1921, which provided readers with access to revolutionary literature kept at the Society for the Study of Wang Fuji, a philosopher from the Qing dynasty of Hunanese history who had defied the Manchus. In an attempt to combat illiteracy, he joined the YMCA mass education movement and changed the textbooks to express radical ideas. He persisted in mobilizing employees to go on strike against Hunan Governor Zhao Hengti's regime. However, labor concerns remained crucial. Despite what later party historians have said, the successful and well-known Anyuan coal mine strikes relied on both bourgeois and proletarian tactics. In addition to organizing the miners, Liu Shaoqi, Li Lisan, and Mao also established cooperatives and schools and involved intellectuals, aristocracy, military personnel, businesspeople, Red Gang dragon chiefs, and even the clergy in the community. Mao's wife Yang Kaihui, who advocated for women's rights in the surrounding peasant communities, particularly reading and education, was also involved in labor organizing activities in the Anyuan mines. Mao and Yang were among the most successful in employing the political organizing technique that combined labor organization among male workers with an emphasis on women's rights concerns in their areas, even though they did not create it. Mao was invited to join the Communist Party's Central Committee by Chen Duxiu as a result of his achievements in political organizing in the Anyuan mines. Mao stated that he misplaced the address and thus missed the Communist Party of China's Second Congress in July 1922 in Shanghai. Following Lenin's lead, the delegates decided to form an alliance with the KMT's bourgeois democrats in order to further the goals of the national revolution. Members of the Communist Party joined the KMT in an effort to shift its policies to the left. Encouraging an alliance across China's socio-economic levels, Mao heartily supported this choice and went on to become the KMT's main propagandist. Being an outspoken opponent of imperialism, Mao attacked the US, UK, and Japanese governments in his works, calling the latter the most murderous of hangmen. 1922 to 1927, cooperation with the Kuomintang. Delegates at the Third Congress of the Communist Party in June 1923 in Shanghai reiterated their intention to cooperate with the KMT. In support of this stance, Mao moved to Shanghai and was elected to the party committee. During the first KMT Congress, which took place in Guangzhou at the beginning of 1924, Mao presented four motions aimed at delegating authority to urban and rural bureaus. He was also elected as an alternate member of the KMT Central Executive Committee. His Hunan buddy Li Lisan became suspicious of him because of his fervent support for the KMT. Mao went back to Shaoshan at the end of 1924, maybe to get better from a sickness. He discovered that the peasants was growing more uneasy and that some of them had taken land from affluent landowners in order to establish communes. This persuaded him of the peasantry's capacity for revolution, a notion supported by KMT leftists but rejected by communists. The proposal by Mao and his associates to terminate ties with the KMT was turned down by Mikhail Borodin, the Comintern delegate. Mao went to Guangzhou in the winter of 1925 when Zhao's local authorities became aware of his revolutionary actions. From May to September 1926, he oversaw the KMT's Peasant Movement Training Institute's sixth session there. Mao's Peasant Movement Training Institute instilled military training exercises, required cadres to read foundational left-wing literature, and prepared them for militant action. Following the death of Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the party, in May 1925, Chiang Kai-shek took over and proceeded to marginalize the communists and the left-leaning KMT. Nevertheless, Mao backed Chiang's National Revolutionary Army when it launched its 1926 warlord-attacking northern expedition. Following this expedition, affluent landowners were often slaughtered, and peasants rose up and took over their land. Senior KMT figures, who were landowners themselves, were incensed by such upheavals, underscoring the widening ideological and socio-economic division within the revolutionary movement. Mao made an appearance at the KMT Central Executive Committee's third plenum in Wuhan in March 1927, which aimed to depose General Chiang by designating Wang Jingwei as leader. Mao actively participated in the talks about the plight of the peasantry there, defending a set of regulations for the repression of local bullies and bad gentry that called for the death penalty or life in prison for anyone found guilty of engaging in counter-revolutionary activities. Mao claimed that peaceful methods cannot suffice in a revolutionary situation. Mao encouraged peasants to refuse to pay rent when he was named to the KMT's 5-member Central Land Committee in April 1927. A second committee led by Mao drafted a draft resolution on the land question that demanded that local bullies and bad gentry, corrupt officials, militarists, and all counter-revolutionary elements in the villages have their land confiscated. He then conducted a land survey, declaring that any individuals possessing more than 30 mows, 4.5 acres, or 13% of the total population, were invariably anti-revolutionary. He acknowledged the need for a flexible land redistribution scheme and the wide variations in revolutionary zeal across the nation. Several people voiced their worries when he presented his findings at the enlarged land committee meeting. Some thought it went too far, while others thought it wasn't far enough. In the end, his recommendations were only partially carried out. American Civil War. Autumn harvest uprisings in Nanchang and autumn, 1927. After the Northern Expedition successfully defeated the warlords, Chiang turned against the communists, who by this time were in the tens of thousands all over China. Disregarding the directives from the KMT leadership in Wuhan, Chiang advanced into Shanghai, a metropolis governed by communist paramilitaries. Chiang unleashed the White Terror and, with the help of the Green Gang, massacred 5,000 people while the communists awaited his arrival. Zhang Zuolin assassinated 19 prominent communists in Beijing. Tens of thousands of communists and suspected communists were slain in May, and the CCP lost about 15,000 of its 25,000 members. Mao had first favored the CCP's continuous backing of the Wuhan KMT administration, but by the time of the CCP's 5th Congress, he had altered his mind and decided to place all of his confidence in the peasant militia. On July 15, the Wuhan government dismissed all communists from the KMT, making the topic moot. To oppose Chiang, the CCP established the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army of China, or Red Army. In what became known as the Nanchang Uprising, a battalion under the command of General Zhu De was instructed to capture the city of Nanchang on August 1, 1927. After 5 days of hard retreat, they marched south to Shantao, where they were driven into the wilderness of Fujian, despite their earlier victory. In an attempt to incite peasant uprisings throughout Hunan, Mao led 4 regiments against Changsha during the Autumn Harvest Uprising after being named Commander-in-Chief of the Red Army. Mao wrote a poem called Changsha, the Night Before the Attack, which is the first of his works to survive. On September 9th, he intended to launch 3 separate attacks on the KMT-held city, but the 4th Regiment betrayed him and attacked the 3rd Regiment instead. Mao's army reached Changsha, but was unable to hold it. On September 15th, he conceded defeat and marched eastward to the Jiangxi Jinggang Mountains with 1,000 survivors. Jinggangshan Base, 1927–1928. Mao was banished from both the Hunan Provincial Committee and the CCP Central Committee while they were in hiding in Shanghai. The reasons given were his military opportunism, his emphasis on rural activities, and his overly forgiving attitude with bad gentry. Particularly the more traditional communists thought the peasants were archaic. And mocked Mao's plan to organize them. Nevertheless, they implemented the 3 measures he had long supported, rejecting the KMT, establishing workers' councils right away, and seizing all land without exception. Mao answered by ignoring them. He founded a base in the Jinggang Mountains, near Jinggangshan City, where he combined 5 villages into a self-governing state and encouraged the theft of wealthy landowners' land, after which they were re-educated and occasionally put to death. He made sure that there were no massacres in the area and went against the Central Committee's recommendation for stricter measures. Mao changed the social and economic landscape of Jinggangshan by promoting literacy and non-hierarchical organizational structures in addition to land redistribution. This helped him win over a large number of local followers. After declaring that even the lame, the deaf, and the blind could all come in useful for the revolutionary struggle, Mao increased the size of his army by enlisting 2 bands of bandits, bringing its total strength to about 1,800 soldiers. He gave his soldiers strict orders that had to be followed immediately, all confiscations had to be given over to the government, and nothing could be taken from the impoverished peasants. He shaped his warriors into a disciplined, effective fighting force by doing this. In an attempt to incite peasant uprisings, the Central Committee dispatched Mao's forces to southern Hunan in the spring of 1928. Mao obeyed despite his skepticism. After suffering significant losses, they fled Hunan after the KMT assaulted them. They had no base now that KMT troops had stormed Jinggangshan. As Mao's army roamed the countryside, they stumbled upon a CCP regiment under the command of General Zhu De and Lin Biao. Unanimously, they made an effort to recapture Jinggangshan. The CCP waged an entrenched guerrilla fight in the highlands for several weeks after the KMT counterattacked and drove them back, despite their initial triumph. Mao was once more ordered by the Central Committee to march to South Hunan, but he refused and stayed at his camp. In contrast, Zhu obeyed and escorted his army out of sight. For 25 days, Mao's forces kept the KMT at bay as he sortied from the camp at night in search of more help. Reunited with the force that had devastated Zhu, they went back to Jinggangshan and recaptured the base. Peng Dehuai's 5th Red Army and a KMT unit that had defected joined them there. There were food shortages during the winter since they could not cultivate enough crops in the mountainous area to satisfy everyone. Mao wed He Zizhen, an 18-year-old revolutionary, in 1928. The couple had 6 children together. China's Jiangxi Soviet Republic, 1929–1934. With 2,000 soldiers and an additional 800 supplied by Peng, Mao and Zhu left the base in January 1929 and moved their troops south, to the Jiangxi region around Tonggu and Xinfeng. Morale suffered throughout the evacuation, and many soldiers disobeyed. They started stealing. This alarmed Li Lisan and the Central Committee, who regarded Mao's army as lumpen proletariat incapable of participating in the consciousness of the proletariat. Li, in accordance with traditional Marxist theory, instructed Mao to divide his army into groups that would be dispatched to propagate the revolutionary cause. Li felt that only the urban proletariat could lead a victorious revolution and saw little need for Mao's peasant guerrillas. In response, Mao said that although he agreed with Li's theory, he would not dissolve his army or leave his base. Li and Mao both believed that the CCP's victory would lead to the global defeat of capitalism and imperialism and that the Chinese Revolution held the key to a worldwide revolution. Members of the Jiangxi Soviet accused him of being too moderate and therefore anti-revolutionary due to internal issues. They attempted to remove Mao in December, which led to the Futian episode, in which supporters of Mao murdered and subjected thousands of opponents to torture. The CCP Central Committee relocated to Jiangxi because it believed it to be a safe haven. It declared Jiangxi to be the autonomous state ruled by communists, the Soviet Republic of China, in November. Zhou Enlai took over Mao's command of the Red Army, despite the fact that he was named chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Mao recovered from tuberculosis in the interim. The Red soldiers were to be surrounded and destroyed by the KMT armies. Outnumbered, Zhou and the new leadership pursued an approach of direct confrontation and conventional warfare, while Mao countered with guerrilla tactics inspired by the writings of ancient military strategists like Sun Tzu. The Red Army was able to successfully repel the first and second encirclements as a result. Chiang Kai-shek himself arrived to oversee the operation, furious at the defeat of his soldiers. He experienced failures as well and withdrew to deal with the additional Japanese incursions into China. The Red Army was eventually able to encircle a population of 3 million people due to the KMT's shift in attention to the defense of China against Japanese expansionism. Mao carried out his plan for land reform. He declared the beginning of a land verification project in November 1931, and it was enlarged in June 1933. In addition, he oversaw educational initiatives and put policies in place to boost female political engagement. Chiang, who saw the communists as a bigger threat than the Japanese, left for Jiangxi and launched the Fifth Encirclement Campaign, which involved surrounding the state with a wall of fire made of concrete and barbed wire and supported by aerial bombardment. Zhou's tactics failed in this campaign. The Red Army's morale declined as they were confined inside and food and medicine grew limited. The decision to evacuate was made by the leadership. March Long, 1934 to 1935. With 85,000 soldiers and 15,000 party cadres, the Red Army burst through the KMT line on the southwest corner of the Jiangxi Soviet at Xinfeng on October 14, 1934, and began the Long March. Many sick and injured people, together with women and children, were left behind in order to make their escape. These people were protected by a group of guerrilla fighters that the KMT slaughtered. After fierce combat, the 100,000 escapees crossed the Xiang River and then the Wu River to reach Guizhou, where they captured Junyi in January 1935. While they were temporarily recuperating in the city, they convened a convention, where Mao was elected to a leadership role, becoming the Politburo chairman and the de facto head of the party and Red Army, partly due to Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin's endorsement of his candidacy. He insisted that they function as a guerrilla army and outlined a plan of action. The communists were to battle the Japanese from the Xinshi Soviet in Shaanxi, northern China. Mao thought that by concentrating on the fight against imperialism, the communists would gain the confidence of the Chinese people, who would then reject the KMT. Mao marched his army from Junyi to the Lushan Pass, where they overcame armed resistance and crossed the river safely. Chiang attempted to lead his forces toward Mao by air, but the communists were able to outwit him and cross the Jinsha River instead. In May, they overcame the more challenging job of crossing the Tatu River by engaging in combat across the looting bridge and seizing looting. They met Zhang Guotao's 50,000-strong CCP 4th Front Army in Mukung, western Sichuan. The army had advanced from the mountain ranges surrounding Mianchan. Together, they traveled to Maokai and subsequently Gansu. Mao and Zhang had different ideas on what to do. Mao wanted to move on to Shaanxi, while Zhang preferred to go west, away from the KMT threat, to Tibet or Sikkim. It was decided that Zhu De would join Zhang and they would part ways. Mao's army advanced north through hundreds of kilometers of grasslands, passing into a quagmire where Manchu tribesmen ambushed them. Was the location of several military deaths from hunger and illness. When they finally arrived in Shaanxi, They had to battle both the KMT and an Islamic cavalry militia before making their way over Mount Lupan and the Min Mountains to the Shinchur Soviet, of which only 7,000 to 8,000 had made it out alive. Mao's position as the party's chief executive was solidified during the Long March. He was appointed chairman of the Military Commission in November 1935. Even though he wouldn't become party chairman until 1943, Mao was the unchallenged leader of the Communist Party from this point on. In October 1935, Mao's forces landed in the Yan'an Soviet and made their home in Bowen until the spring of 1936. While there, they established relationships with the locals, farmed and redistributed the land, provided healthcare, and started literacy initiatives. With the addition of He Long's troops from Hunan and the forces of Zhu De and Zhang Guotao who had returned from Tibet, Mao now commanded 15,000 warriors. They opened the Northwest Anti-Japanese Red Army University in Yan'an in February 1936, and since then, they have trained a growing number of fresh troops. They launched an anti-Japanese expedition in January 1937, sending guerrilla forces into Japanese-occupied territory to launch intermittent attacks. A communist conference was called in Yan'an in May 1937 to discuss the situation. Western reporters also arrived in the border region, as the Soviet had been renamed. Edgar Snow, who drew inspiration for Red Star over China from his experiences, and Agnes Smedley, whose reports attracted attention to Mao's cause on a global scale, were among the most notable. Mao's wife He Zizhen had suffered a head injuries from shrapnel during the Long March. After she traveled to Moscow for medical care, Mao divorced her and wed Jiang Qing, an actress. According to reports, He Zizhen was dispatched to a mental asylum in Moscow to make room for Qing. After relocating to a cave home, Mao read a lot, took care of his garden, and developed theories. His belief was that a communist-led government of national defense needed be established with the KMT and other bourgeois nationalist factions in order to defeat the Japanese, as the Red Army was not strong enough to do so on its own. Despite hating Chiang Kai-shek and considering him a traitor to the nation, on May 5 he sent a cable to the Nanjing National Government's Military Council suggesting a military alliance, a move supported by Stalin. Even though Chiang meant to disregard Mao's advice and carry on with the civil war, he was detained in Xi'an by one of his own generals, Zhang Xueliang, which sparked the Xi'an incident. Zhang made Chiang talk to the communists about the matter, which led to the United Front's formation on December 25, 1937, with compromises made by both sides. The Japanese were driving the Kuomintang government inland to Chongqing after seizing both Shanghai and Nanjing, which led to the Nanjing massacre, an atrocity Mao never discussed in his whole life. Due to the savagery of the Japanese, more and more Chinese entered the battle, and there was a 500,000-strong increase in the Red Army. Chiang's National Revolutionary Army was ostensibly in charge of the new Fourth Army and the Eighth Route Army, which the Red Army established in August 1938. The Red Army launched the 100 Regiments Offensive in August 1940, launching simultaneous attacks on the Japanese in 5 provinces with 400,000 soldiers. 20,000 Japanese lives were lost as a result of the military victory, which also caused railroad disruption and the closure of a coal mine. Writing many books for his soldiers from his base in Yan'an, Mao covered guerrilla and mobile military tactics in protracted warfare, introduced the Marxist theory of knowledge in philosophy of revolution, and outlined new democratic principles in On New Democracy. Civil War resuming, 1940 to 1949. The Dixie Mission was the name of the special diplomatic mission that the United States sent to the Chinese Communist Party in 1944. Positive impressions were left on the American forces deployed to the assignment. Compared to the Kuomintang, the party appeared cleaner, more cohesive, and more adamant in its opposition to Japan. The soldiers attested to their superiors that the party was powerful and well-liked throughout a large region. By the mission's end, the US's connections with the Chinese Communist Party produced very little fruit. Following the end of World War II, the United States maintained its diplomatic and military support to Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT government forces in their conflict with Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army, PLA, during the Civil War, giving up on the notion of a coalition government with the CCP. Similarly, in March 1946, the Soviet Union secretly handed over control of northeastern China to the Chinese Communists, therefore supporting Mao. The People's Liberation Army starved out the Kuomintang forces occupying Changchun in 1948 on orders directly from Mao. During the June to October siege, at least 160,000 civilians are thought to have died. The siege was compared to Hiroshima by PLA Lieutenant Colonel Zhang Jinglu, who wrote about it in his book White Snow, Red Blood. The casualties were nearly the same. Changchun took 5 months, but Hiroshima took 9 seconds. The Kuomintang troops lost heavily to Mao's forces on January 21, 1949, in pivotal battles. Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan from the Chinese mainland when PLA forces besieged Chongqing and Chengdu early on December 10, 1949. China's leadership. The People's Republic of China was founded. On October 1, 1949, Mao declared the People's Republic of China to have been established from the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen, and later that week, he said, the Chinese people have stood up. Mao traveled to Moscow in the winter of 1949-50 for in-depth discussions. Mao started the discussions, which were centered on politics and China's economic transformation, foreign policy, railroads, naval installations, and Soviet financial and technical support. The outcome was a deal that demonstrated Stalin's power and determination to support Mao. Lenin had a big impact on Mao's Marxist beliefs, especially when it came to vanguardism. Mao thought that the only way China could move towards socialism was under the proper leadership of the Communist Party. On the other hand, Mao also thought that in order to hold the bureaucracy in check, public movements and mass criticism were required. Korean War. Mao forced the party to plan efforts to expand its power and reform society. When Mao decided to send the People's Volunteer Army, a special force of the People's Liberation Army, into the Korean War in October 1950, these campaigns gained immediacy. To battle, as well as bolster North Korea's armed forces, the Korean People's Army, which were in full retreat. As a result of its engagement in the Korean War, the United States imposed a trade embargo on the People's Republic, which remained in effect until Richard Nixon improved relations. During the fight, at least 180,000 Chinese troops died. Mao oversaw activities to the smallest detail. As chairman of the Central Military Commission, CMC, he also served as the PLA and People's Republic Supreme Commander-in-Chief, as well as party chairman. Chinese troops in Korea were commanded by the newly minted Premier Zhou Enlai, with General Peng Dehuai serving as field commander and political commissar. Social reform. During the land reform campaigns, many landowners and wealthier peasants were beaten to death at Communist Party-organized mass assemblies as land was removed from them and redistributed to poorer peasants, resulting in major economic disparity reduction. The campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries targeted the bureaucratic bourgeoisie, including compradors, merchants, and Kuomintang officials, whom the party viewed as economic parasites or political opponents. In 1976, the United States State Department claimed that up to 1 million people were killed during the land reform and 800,000 during the counter-revolutionary campaign. Mao claimed that 700,000 people were died in attacks on counter-revolutionaries between 1950 and 1952. The number of killings ranged between 2 million and 5 million as a result of a policy of selecting at least one landlord, and usually several, in virtually every village for public execution. Furthermore, at least 1.5 million individuals, possibly as many as 4 to 6 million, were transferred to reform through labor camps, where many died. Mao personally oversaw the mass repressions and developed a system of execution quotas that were frequently surpassed. He justified the executions as vital for the consolidation of power. During the 1950s, the Maoist government is credited with eradicating both opium consumption and manufacturing through unbridled repression and social change. 10 million addicts were pushed into compulsory treatment, and dealers were executed. Opium-producing regions were also planted with new crops. The remaining opium production relocated south of the Chinese border to the Golden Triangle region. 3 and 5 Anti-campaigns. Beginning in 1951, Mao launched 2 subsequent movements aimed at ridding metropolitan regions of corruption by targeting affluent capitalists and political opponents, called as the 3 and 5 Anti-campaigns. Unlike the 3 Anti-campaign, which focused on purging government, industrial, and party leaders, the 5 Anti-campaign was broader in scope, attacking capitalist forces in general. Workers reported their bosses, spouses turned on their marriages, and children told on their parents. Victims were frequently humiliated during struggle sessions, in which a targeted individual was verbally and physically beaten until they confessed to crimes. Mao urged that small violators be chastised, rehabilitated, or sent to labor camps, while the worst among them should be shot. These campaigns claimed several 100,000 extra lives, the vast majority of which were suicides. Suicide by jumping from tall buildings has become so widespread in Shanghai that citizens avoid strolling on the street near towers for fear of being hit by one. Some biographers have stated that forcing those viewed as adversaries to suicide was a typical approach throughout the Mao era. In his biography of Mao, Philip Short recalls that Mao gave specific instructions in the Yan'an rectification movement that no cadre is to be killed, but in actuality permitted security head Kong Sheng to drive opponents to suicide. Furthermore, this pattern was repeated throughout his leadership of the People's Republic. China's 5-year plans. Mao instituted the first 5-year plan, 1953 to 1958, which placed a strong focus on rapid industrial development after the consolidation of power. Large, very capital-intensive plants were to be built in the industries of iron and steel, coal, electric power, heavy engineering, building materials, and basic chemicals. With Soviet help, several of these plants were constructed, and heavy industry expanded quickly. Socialist cooperatives were the means of organizing trade, industry, and agriculture collectively. China's fast industrialization, which began at this time and produced great success, began. Mao dreaded the reactionary restoration in Hungary as the Hungarian crisis worsened, even though he had initially supported Imre Nagy's reformist government. Mao requested Liu Shaoqi to alert Soviet delegates to the need for military action against Western imperialist-backed demonstrators and Nagy's administration in order to resist the withdrawal of Soviet soldiers. It was unclear, nevertheless, whether Mao's position was very important or had any bearing at all on Khrushchev's decision to attack Hungary. Furthermore, it was not apparent if China's weak strength projections relative to the USSR and economic concerns drove it to adopt the Soviet stance. Even though he disapproved of Moscow's leadership inside the socialist camp, Mao placed greater value on the integrity of the global communist revolution than the sovereignty of the individual nations that made up the Soviet sphere of influence. Mao's 100 Flowers campaign was also influenced by the Hungarian Revolution. Mao made the decision to compromise with the intelligentsia in China, allowing them to voice their concerns of the mistakes made by the government and their dissatisfaction with society. Mao hoped to stop a similar revolution in China by using this movement. But after the 100 Flowers campaign, when Chinese citizens started to question Mao's leadership and the CCP's actions, he clamped down on the movement, calling it a counter-revolutionary Hungarian revolution. Mao purportedly showed during the 100 Flowers campaign that he was open to hearing other perspectives on how China ought to be run. With the ability to speak freely, educated and progressive Chinese started to criticize the Communist Party and its leadership. At first, this was accepted and even encouraged. After a few months, Mao's government changed course and began to punish the roughly 500,000 people who had criticized the party as well as those who were only accused of being critical, a campaign known as the anti-rightist movement. At least 550,000 persons were persecuted as a result of the movement, the majority of them were intellectuals and dissidents. Mao's physician, Li Jisui, said that the strategy had originally been intended to stifle opposition to him within the party. He was taken aback by the intensity of the criticism and the fact that it eventually turned against his own leadership. Military undertakings. Mao launched China's nuclear program in response to threats made by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower during the First Taiwan Strait crisis to use nuclear bombs against military targets in the province of Fujian. China built the atomic and hydrogen bombs in record time under Mao's 2 bombs, 1 satellite program, and a few years after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the country launched a satellite. The People's Republic of China conducted a covert military experiment in 1967 under the code name Project 523 to develop anti-malarial drugs. Called after the project's inception date of May 23, it tackled malaria, a significant issue during the Vietnam War. According to the minutes of the conference, Zhou Enlai persuaded Mao Zedong to begin the mass project in order to keep Allies' troops combat ready at the request of North Vietnamese Prime Minister Ho Chi Minh. A total of 500 Chinese scientists were hired. 3 streams were created for the project. Artemisinins are a novel class of antimalarial medications that were discovered and developed as a result of the investigation into traditional Chinese medicine. Project 523 was started during the Cultural Revolution and continued until it was formally ended in 1981. Fantastic advance. The Great Leap Forward, which was Mao's second 5-year plan, was introduced in January 1958. Its goal was to transform China from an agrarian nation into an industrialized one and served as an alternative economic growth model to the Soviet model, which was supported by other party members and focused primarily on heavy industry. The relatively small agricultural collectives that had been established up to this point under this economic program were quickly combined into significantly bigger people's communes, and a huge number of the peasants were made to work on large-scale infrastructural projects as well as the manufacturing of iron and steel. A portion of the private food production industry was outlawed, and communal ownership was established for cattle and farming equipment. During the Great Leap Forward, Mao and other party officials directed the new communes to use a range of untested and unscientific new farming methods. The labor shift toward infrastructure and steel manufacturing, along with periodic natural disasters, resulted in a 15% decrease in grain production in 1959, a 10% decline in 1960, and no recovery in 1961. Every stratum in the party overstated the quantity of grain produced beneath them in an attempt to gain favor with their superiors and avoid being eliminated. Party cadres were instructed to seize a disproportionately large quantity of that bogus harvest for state use, mostly for use in the cities, based on the fraudulently stated success. In cities, as well as for export. As a result, farmers had little food left for themselves, and millions of people starved to death during the Great Chinese Famine, which was made worse in some regions by drought and in others by floods. In China, food stamps were provided to the urban population once a month, while the rural populace was expected to cultivate their own crops and return a portion of them to the government. China's rural death toll exceeded that of the country's metropolitan mortality. Furthermore, the Chinese government persisted in exporting food that could have been given to the nation's starving populace. Approximately 30 million Chinese peasants perished as a direct result of the famine between 1959 and 1962. Furthermore, after the Great Leap Forward ended in 1962, a large number of children who had become malnourished during difficult years passed away. Mao denounced the Great Leap Forward's methods in the late fall of 1958. These practices included making peasants work long hours without enough food or relaxation, which led to diseases and hunger. Additionally, he conceded that production at the expense of livelihood was mostly caused by anti-rightist initiatives. He insisted that these issues be addressed even if he was unwilling to give up on the Great Leap Forward in order to resolve them. Along with the radical ideas he had previously abandoned, Mao launched a new anti-rightist campaign following his confrontation with Peng Dehuai at the Lushan Conference in July 1959. Mao did not take anything to put an end to the anomalous deaths and other abuses. Instead, he would only voice his concerns about them once again in the spring of 1960. In order to accomplish severe ideological and developmental goals, the chairman willfully ignored the lessons of the first radical phase, according to Bernstein's conclusion. According to Jasper Becker, Mao disregarded claims of food shortages in the countryside and refused to budge, thinking that kulaks and rightists were stockpiling grain and that peasants were lying. He objected to the state granaries opening. Instead, they started a string of anti-grain concealment campaigns that led to many purges and suicides. Party leaders conducted violent campaigns in which they searched villages for secret food stores, not just grain, as Mao set quotas for poultry, eggs, pigs, and ducks. Many peasants who were suspected of hiding food were killed by beatings and torture. There is disagreement on how much Mao knew about the gravity of the situation. Li Jisui, Mao's personal physician, speculated that Mao might not have known the full scope of the famine since some local officials were reluctant to criticize his policies and his staff was eager to fabricate or exaggerate reports. Li writes that upon learning of the extent of the starvation, Mao vowed to stop eating meat, an action followed by his staff. Mao resigned as China's president on April 27, 1959, although he continued to hold important roles as the Central Military Commission's chairman and the Communist Party's chairman. Liu Shaoqi was transferred to the presidency. Mao eventually had to give up the program in 1962, at which point Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping overthrew him in the political arena. For the great majority of Chinese people, the Great Leap Forward was a disaster. Almost all of the alleged steel produced in rural areas, despite the official achievement of steel quotas, was iron instead of steel since it was produced in homemade furnaces using a variety of scrap metal instead of a dependable fuel source like coal. This implied that it was impossible to attain ideal smelting conditions. A geometry teacher in rural Shanghai during the Great Leap Forward, Zhang Rongmei, said, "We took everything we had in our house, including furniture, pots, and pans, and all of our neighbors did the same. We burned all the metal by throwing everything into a massive fire." The famine's severe effects were directed on the state's adversaries. Jasper Becker explains. Those Mao referred to as enemies of the people made up approximately 5% of China's population and were the most vulnerable. When it came to food distribution, those who had previously been classified as black elements during repressive campaigns received the least priority. The majority of those who perished were landlords, wealthy peasants, ex-members of the nationalist government, religious figures, rightists, counter-revolutionaries, and their families. According to official Chinese statistics for Second Five-Year Plan, 1958 to 1962, industrial output value had doubled, the gross value of agricultural products increased by 35%. Steel production in 1962 was between 10.6 million tons or 12 million tons. Investment in capital construction rose to 40% from 35% in the first five-year plan period. The investment in capital construction was doubled, and the average income of workers and farmers increased by up to 30%. State Chairman Liu Shaoqi criticized the Great Leap Forward and blamed the initiative for widespread starvation in China during a sizable Communist Party conference in Beijing in January 1962, known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference. Delegates were overwhelmingly in accord, but Defense Minister Lin Biao steadfastly upheld Mao. After a brief period of liberalization, Mao and Lin began to plan their return. By dissolving the people's communes, establishing some private management of peasant smallholdings, and importing grain from Canada and Australia to lessen the worst effects of hunger, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping saved the economy. Several ministers voiced their concerns that the Great Leap Forward had not been as successful as anticipated during the July-August 1959 Lushan Conference. General Peng Dehuai, a veteran of the Korean War and Minister of Defense, was the most direct of these. Mao ordered a purge of Peng and his allies in response to Peng's criticism of the Great Leap Forward, which stifled criticism of the Great Leap programs. Senior officials were labeled as right opportunists for informing Mao of the famine's reality. Following the start of a campaign against right-wing opportunism, party members and common peasants were taken to prison labor camps, where many would later perish from starvation. Years later, the CCP came to the conclusion that the campaign may have wrongfully punished up to 6 million people. There is much debate over how many people perished from famine during the Great Leap Forward. Little was known about the extent of the catastrophe in the Chinese countryside until the mid-1980s, when the Chinese government finally released official census results. The few Western observers who were granted entry during this time were only permitted to visit model villages, where they were led to believe that the Great Leap Forward had been a great success. Additionally, as China continued to claim record harvests and was a net exporter of grain during the period, there was a perception that the stream of individual stories of starvation that had been reaching the West, particularly through Hong Kong and Taiwan, must have been localized or exaggerated. Grain was sent to fellow communist regimes in North Korea, North Vietnam, and Albania at no cost, while exports rose by 50% as a result of Mao's need to repay the Soviet Union's debts, which totaled 1.973 billion yuan between 1960 and 1962. China conducted its first census in 1953 and again in 1964 and 1982. Dr. Judith Bannister, an American demographer, conducted the first analysis of this data to determine the number of starvation deaths, which was published in 1984. It is challenging to get an exact number because of the long intervals between the censuses and uncertainties regarding the accuracy of the data. Bannister came to the conclusion that, despite the official data, there were about 15 million excess deaths in China between 1958 and 1961. Based on her modeling of Chinese demographics during that time and accounting for presumed underreporting during the famine years, she estimated that the actual number was closer to 30 million. Hu Yaobang, a senior CCP official, claims that official government statistics indicate that 20 million people perished. 36 million deaths are estimated by Yang Jisheng, a former reporter for the Xinhua news agency who had access to confidential information and contacts that other experts were not privy to. According to Frank Dikötter's estimation, between 1958 and 1962, the Great Leap Forward was responsible for at least 45 million preventable deaths. The number has been estimated by several additional sources to be between 20 and 46 million. Breaking out from the Soviet Union. The decade was characterized by China's increasing isolation on the international scene. Nikita Khrushchev withdrew all Soviet technical expertise and aid from China as a result of the Sino-Soviet split. The disagreement centered on global communism's leadership. China established its own alternative network to compete with the USSR's network of communist parties for local control of the left in other nations. According to Lorenz M. Luthi, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Second Vietnam War, and the Sino-American rapprochement were all significant Cold War moments, but the Sino-Soviet split was even more significant. The division affected the Second Vietnam War's trajectory specifically and contributed to the formation of the Second Cold War's broader framework. Following Stalin's death in March 1953, Khrushchev took over as Soviet leader in a more moderate manner, which led to the divide. Only Albania openly sided with China, which led to the formation of an alliance between the two nations that persisted until Mao's passing in 1976. Recognizing that the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons, Mao downplayed the danger. According to Becker, Mao believed that the bomb was a paper tiger, declaring to Khrushchev that it would not matter if China lost 300 million people in a nuclear war. The other half of the population would survive to ensure victory. And key part of Mao's attempt to steer the revolution in the right path was his fight against US imperialism and Soviet revisionism. Mao composed reading notes in response to Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR and writings, a critique of Soviet economics, in response to the Soviet book Political Economy, a textbook in the late 1950s. Mao's beliefs that the USSR was losing its connection to the people and stifling communist advancement are reflected in these writings. As part of his effort to restore his domestic political influence and limit that of his rivals by displaying his dedication to revolution and his strong position against what he perceived to be Soviet revisionism, historian Minjiang Li claims that Mao purposefully increased Sino-Soviet diplomatic relations. Front 3. China's government reduced the rate of development after the Great Leap Forward failed. It concentrated on producing consumer items and increased its investments in China's coastal areas. The third five-year plan's preliminary drafts made no mention of expanding large-scale industries in interior China. Following the conclusion in an April 1964 General Staff assessment that China was susceptible to foreign attack due to the concentration of its industry in its key coastal cities, Mao promoted the growth of national defense and basic industries in secure areas of China's interior. Mao's industrialization program, known as the Third Front, gained momentum after the Gulf of Tonkin incident on August 2, 1964, despite the opposition of other influential officials. This event heightened fears of an American invasion. Mao became increasingly concerned about an American invasion after the Gulf of Tonkin event. "There is going to be a war," he warned in a letter to Central cadres. "I must take stock of what I've done," and worked even more to establish the Third Front. Massive building projects were undertaken as part of the covert Third Front construction, including the Chengdu-Kunming Line, a vast railroad network, aerospace facilities, and Panzerhua Iron and Steel, a steel production company. The Cultural Revolution in 1966 caused the Third Front's development to slow down, but after the Sino-Soviet boundary dispute at Jinbao Island raised fears of a Soviet invasion, it picked back up speed. Following U.S. President Richard Nixon's 1972 visit to China and the ensuing warming of relations between the two countries, Third Front construction once more declined. Following Mao's death, China initiated reform and opening up, which involved progressively closing Third Front initiatives. By dispersing human and material resources across the nation, the Third Front reduced regional differences and fostered the ideal environment for future market expansion. The Great Cultural Revolution of the Proletariat. In the early 1960s, Mao started to worry about the state of China after 1959. He realized that the old ruling elite had been replaced by a new one as a result of the revolution and Great Leap Forward. He worried about the people in positions of authority growing far from the people they were supposed to represent. The ruling class would be overthrown and unsettled, according to Mao, and China would remain in a condition of continuous revolution that would, in theory, serve the interests of the vast majority rather than a small and privileged few. General Secretary Deng Xiaoping and State Chairman Liu Shaoqi supported the idea of removing Mao from his position as China's head of state and government but keeping him in his ceremonial and symbolic capacity as the party's chairman, preserving all of his beneficial contributions to the revolution. By seizing control of economic policies and making political demands, they made an effort to marginalize Mao. Many argue that Mao's 1966 Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was a reaction to Liu and Deng's efforts. According to certain academics, including Mobo Gao, the evidence supporting this is exaggerated. Some, like Frank Dikötter, contend that Mao started the Cultural Revolution as a means of exacting retribution on anybody who dared to disagree with him regarding the Great Leap Forward. In addition to imprisoning a great number of Chinese civilians and destroying a large portion of the nation's traditional cultural legacy, the Cultural Revolution also caused widespread economic and social unrest in China. During this time, the Cultural Revolution tore through every aspect of Chinese society, as seen in the films To Live, The Blue Kite, and Goodbye My Concubine, which chronicled the destruction of millions of lives. It is thought that the violence during the Cultural Revolution claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Among them were well-known individuals like Liu Shaoqi. Mao is said to have said the following after learning of these losses, especially the fact that people had been driven to commit suicide: "Don't try to save someone who is attempting suicide. China is such a populous country that we are not in need of a small number of people." The Red Guards were given carte blanche by the authorities to murder and mistreat regime opponents. "Don't say it is wrong of them to beat up bad persons. If in anger they beat someone to death, then so be it," stated National Police Chief Xia Fuji. There were reportedly 1,772 Red Guard murders in Beijing alone in August and September of 1966. It was at this time that Mao selected Lin Biao, who appeared to share every idea, to succeed him. Later on, Lin was formally designated as Mao's successor. There was clearly a difference between the two men by 1971. China's official history claims that Lin was plotting either a military takeover or Mao's killing. On September 13, 1971, Lin Biao perished in an aircraft collision over Mongolian airspace, most likely while escaping China and waiting to be apprehended. After declaring that Lin intended to remove Mao from office, the CCP dismissed Lin from the party after his death. Mao began to lose faith in many of the leading CCP figures at this point. The highest-ranking intelligence defector from the Soviet bloc, Lieutenant General Ion Mihai Pasipa, stated he spoke with Nicolae Ceausescu and learned of a KGB organized plot to assassinate Mao with Lin Biao's assistance. Mao declared the Cultural Revolution over in 1969, although a number of historians both inside and outside of China believe that the Cultural Revolution ended, either completely or in part, in 1976 after Mao's death and the Gang of Four's incarceration. The Cultural Revolution was formally deemed a severe setback for the PRC by the Central Committee in 1981. In all academic areas, it is frequently seen as a highly disruptive time for China. Mao's economic policies resulted in significant poverty despite his regime's rhetoric advocating for poverty. The number of people killed during the Cultural Revolution, both Red Guards and civilians, varies widely in estimates. Maurice Meisner states that an estimate of about 400,000 deaths is a generally recognized minimum amount. According to McFarher and Schoenholz, there were almost 36 million victims of persecution in rural China alone. Of these, between 750,000 and 1.5 million individuals died, and a similar number suffered lifelong injuries. The 1950s saw Mao's personality hardening. According to historian Daniel Leese, the impression of Mao's personality that emerges from the literature is disturbing. It shows a specific chronological progression from a reasonable leader, who was kind when things went well and thought about the boundaries of his authority from time to time, to a despicable and conceited autocrat. Mao's ability to take criticism got progressively worse. State visits. Only twice did Mao leave China while he was leader, and both trips were official visits to the Soviet Union. His first overseas trip took place in December 1949 to Moscow to commemorate Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's 70th birthday. East German Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers Walter Ulbricht and Communist General Secretary Yumjagin Tsedenbal of Mongolia were also there. Mao's attendance at the 40th anniversary, Ruby Jubilee, celebrations of the October Revolution, which included both the annual military parade of the Moscow garrison on Red Square and a banquet in the Moscow Kremlin, was one of the highlights of his two-week state visit to Moscow in November 1957. And the International Conference of Communist and Workers' Parties, where he had meetings with prominent communist leaders like Enver Hoxha of Albania and Kim Il-sung of North Korea. Following Mao's resignation as leader of state on April 27, 1959, President Liu Shaoqi, Premier Zhou Enlai, or Deputy Premier Deng Xiaoping made further diplomatic state visits and international travels to the Soviet Union and other nations instead of Mao directly. Death and its aftermath. Mao's health deteriorated in his final years, most likely as a result of his chain smoking. The fact that he experienced numerous heart and lung conditions in his later years was kept a state secret. Unverified rumors suggest that he may have suffered Parkinson's disease in addition to Lou Gehrig's illness, commonly known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He met visiting Pakistani Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on May 27, 1976, which is the last known photo of him alive and his last public appearance. He had two significant heart attacks in March and July, followed by a third on September 5, which left him disabled. At the age of 82, he passed away almost 4 days later, on September 9, 1976, at 0:10. His death was not made public by the Communist Party until 1600 hours, when a nationwide radio broadcast broke the news and made a plea for party cohesion. For a week, Mao's embalmed body rested in state at the Great Hall of the People, covered in the CCP flag. While Westerners watched on television, 1 million Chinese filed past to pay their last respects, many of them sobbing or exhibiting anguish. The words, "Carry on the cause" left by Chairman Mao and "Carry on the cause of proletarian revolution to the end" were displayed next to Mao's official image on the wall. His internal organs were preserved in formaldehyde at the 305 hospital, where the body was transported in a van on September 17. On September 18, there was a 3-minute mandated quiet and simultaneous blowing of guns, sirens, whistles, and horns throughout China. A military band performed the Internationale as millions of people crowded into Tiananmen Square. Atop Tiananmen Gate, Hua Guofeng gave a 20-minute eulogy to end the event. Mao requested that his body be incinerated, but instead the Chinese people paid their homage by having his remains placed on permanent display in the Mao Zedong Mausoleum. The resolution on certain questions in the history of our party since the founding of the People's Republic of China, which evaluated the party's priorities moving forward and the legacy of Mao's era, was adopted by the Central Committee of the Communist Party on June 27, 1981. The resolution outlines failures from 1957 to 1964, although largely validating this time frame, and significant errors starting in 1965. Blaming Mao's mistakes on his individualist inclinations, which emerged after he broke from the leadership's unified vision. In terms of Mao's legacy, the resolution comes to the conclusion that his contributions to the Chinese Revolution greatly exceeded his errors. History. Mao is still a contentious figure, and opinions on his legacy are divided both inside and outside of China. He is considered to be among the 20th century's most significant and influential people. In addition, he is regarded as a visionary, poet, military strategist, political thinker, and theorist. He was acclaimed and given credit for uniting China, putting an end to the civil war that had lasted for decades, and driving imperialism out of the country. In addition, he is recognized for having raised the position of women in China and for advancing education and literacy. Approximately 85% of the 1,045 respondents to a study conducted in December 2013 by the state-run Global Times said they thought Mao's accomplishments outweighed his shortcomings. In China, the saying goes that Mao was 70% correct and 30% incorrect. According to some accounts, during his 27-year reign, his policies caused the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese citizens, more than any other leader of the 20th century, through mass executions, starvation, persecution, and prison labor in Laogai. Estimates of the number of people who perished under his regime range from 40 million to as much as 80 million. Mao rarely provided explicit orders for the physical extermination of individuals. Biographer Philip Short claims that of the people killed by Mao's policies, 3 or 4 million were necessary victims in his perspective in the fight to alter China, while the vast majority were unintentional victims of famine. It is said that Mao's China was an authoritarian and totalitarian state that destroyed religious and cultural monuments and artifacts, especially during the Cultural Revolution, and engaged in widespread repression. Under his leadership, China's population increased from about 550 million to over 900 million, and the government did not strictly enforce family planning laws. As a result, his successors, including Deng Xiaoping, adopted stringent one-child policies to address the issue of overpopulation. Rebels are still using Mao's revolutionary strategies, and many communist organizations worldwide are still committed to his political philosophy. Mao is highly regarded by the majority of the populace in mainland China as well as by many Chinese Communist Party members and sympathizers. Mao is credited by Mobo Gao in his 2008 book The Battle for China's Past. Mao and the Cultural Revolution for bringing unity and stability to a country that had been plagued by civil wars and foreign invasions, and for laying the groundwork for China to become the equal of the great global powers, by increasing the average life expectancy from 35 in 1949 to 63 by 1975. Along with his extensive land reform, Gao commends him for elevating women's standing, advancing popular literacy, and constructively transform Chinese society beyond recognition. In addition to nearly doubling life expectancy and building China's infrastructure and industry, Mao is credited with increasing literacy. Only 20% of the population could read in 1949, compared to 65.5% 30 years later, and laying the groundwork for China's rise to prominence in the global economy. China has also been critical of Mao. In mainland China, criticizing him can result in censorship or professional consequences, so people tend to voice their disagreements in private online. Weibo users backed television anchor Bai Fu-jen when a video of her disparaging Mao at a private dinner in 2015 went viral. In a poll, 80% of respondents said that Bai shouldn't apologize in the face of criticism from state affiliates. In the West, Mao is not a very popular person. He is well known for the Great Leap Forward deaths and the Cultural Revolution persecutions. Despite being aware of Mao's errors, many Chinese people still regard him as a national hero. He is credited with effectively rescuing the nation from both Western imperialist exploitation during the Opium Wars and Japanese occupation. About the Maoist era, 70 Chinese interviewees were questioned between 2015 and 2018. Their answers were a mixture of trauma and nostalgia. There was less inequality back then, and life was easier and had a clear purpose. People trusted and supported one another. However, they also admitted to the unpleasant experiences and claimed that their material life was inadequate. To commemorate the 115th anniversary of Mao Zedong's birth, China welcomed visitors to his birthplace in central Hunan province on December 25, 2008. Disagreements about Mao's legacy persist. According to Su Shachi, a former party official, he was a great historical criminal, but he was also a great force for good. Journalist Liu Binyan has similarly referred to Mao as both monster and genius. Mao's personal secretary and Communist Party ally Li Rui said that Mao had a terrifying way of thinking and ruling. He did not regard human life at all. He didn't care about other people dying. One of Mao's and Deng Xiaoping's top aides, Chen Yun, said, "If Mao had died in 1956, his achievements would have been immortal. Even if he had passed away in 1966, he would have been a wonderful man with flaws." But 1976 saw his death. Unfortunately, what can one say? Deng Xiaoping stated, "It is important to remember that Chairman Mao devoted the majority of his life to China, that he preserved the party and the revolution throughout their most dire times, and that, in summary, his impact was so enormous that, in his absence, it would have been even more difficult for Chinese folks to locate the correct way out of the darkness." We must also remember that Chairman Mao was the one who creatively applied the ideas of Marx and Lenin to politics as well as philosophy, art, literature, and military strategy. He was the one who blended their teachings with the facts of Chinese history. Mao was a successful creator and ultimately an evil destroyer, according to Alexander V, Pantsov and Stephen I. Levine's 2013 biography Mao, The Real Story. However, the authors also contended that Mao was a complex man who shouldn't be hero-worshipped or reduced to a demon because he, in fact, tried his best to bring about prosperity and gain international respect for his country. The following were their comments on Mao's legacy. Mao goes down in history as a bloody social reformer and a hero of the national revolution, but he was also a brilliant Chinese politician, historian, poet, and philosopher, an all-powerful dictator and vivacious organizer, a skillful diplomat and utopian socialist, the head of the most populous state, resting on his laurels. His life was too big to be boiled down to just one lesson. In his autobiography The Man Who Stayed Behind, Mao's English interpreter Sidney Rittenberg stated that although Mao was a great leader in history, he was moreover a great criminal because, not that he wanted to, not that he intended to, but in fact, his wild fantasies led to the deaths of tens of millions of people. CCP officials glorified violence and were inured to massive loss of life, according to Dicotter. They all adhered to the same worldview, which said that the methods justified the ends. Li Jingquan compared the Great Leap Forward to the Long March, in which only 1 in 10 people had survived, in 1962 after his province had lost millions of people. He said, "We are not weak, we are stronger, we have kept the backbone." Dicotter emphasizes that despite Mao's ability to perceive the human cost, the large-scale irrigation projects went on unabated for a number of years, eventually taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of weary villagers. Claiming that Mao was one of the great tyrants of the 20th century and that his death toll exceeded that of both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, some historians compare Mao to these figures. Mao genuinely liked the comparisons made to him, as he was often compared to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a united China. In 1958, Mao declared, in a lecture to party cadres, that he had greatly surpassed Qin Shi Huang in his persecution of intellectuals. How much was he worth? We buried 46,000 intellectuals, but he buried only 460 alive. Did we not murder some counter-revolutionary intellectuals in the process of suppressing the counter-revolutionaries? I argued with the democratic people once, saying, you say we're like Qin Shi Huang, but you're not right, we're 100 times better. Its use of such measures has led some critics to draw comparisons with Nazi Germany. In response to similarities, Philip Short argues that whereas the vast majority of deaths under Mao were unintentional results of starvation, the murders perpetrated by Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were primarily systematic and deliberate. It was briefly suggested that Mao's conviction in redemption through thinking reform prevented the landlord class from being wiped out as a people. He contrasted Mao with Chinese reformers of the 19th century, who opposed China's traditional values during the country's conflicts with Western colonial forces. According to Short, Mao's tragedy and his grandeur were that he remained to the end enthralled to his own revolutionary dreams. He freed China from the straitjacket of its Confucian past, but the bright red future he promised turned out to be a sterile purgatory. Due to the People's Republic's participation in the Korean War, the United States imposed a trade embargo on it. This embargo lasted until Richard Nixon concluded that cultivating ties with the PRC would be beneficial when interacting with the Soviet Union. Mao transformed China from a feudal backwater into one of the most powerful countries in the world, the television show Biography said. Few would contest the fact that he brought China into the 20th century. The corrupt and outdated Chinese system he toppled was one of his accomplishments. But at a startling cost in real lives. Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom of the University of California, Irvine compares China's relationship with Mao to Americans' remembrance of Andrew Jackson in his 2010 book China in the 21st Century. What everyone needs to know. Both nations view the leaders favorably, despite their respective roles in disastrous policies. Mao led the brutal years of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, during which Jackson forced Native Americans to walk the Trail of Tears, resulting in thousands of deaths. According to John King Fairbank, the basic facts of Mao's career seem incredible. At the age of 28, along with a dozen others, he founded a party in a vast country of 400 million people, and over the course of the next 50 years, he organized, won power, reshaped the people, and reshaped the land. History records no greater achievement. No antecedent has ever achieved the extent of accomplishments possessed by Mao Zedong, since no other country has ever been as old and large as China. This includes Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, all the rulers of Europe, Napoleon, Bismarck, and Lenin. In a new history of China, future historians may conclude that Mao's role was to try to destroy the age-old bifurcation of China between a small educated ruling stratum and the vast mass of common people, Fairbank and Goldman said in their assessment of Mao's legacy. We still don't know the extent of his success. Although the economy was growing, his successors were tasked with establishing a new political system. Eternal rebel, refusing to be bound by the laws of God or man, nature or Marxism, he led his people for 3 decades in pursuit of an initially noble vision that turned increasingly into a mirage, and then into a nightmare, wrote Stuart R. Schramm in The Thought of Mao Zedong, 1989. Was he a ruler with unrestrained ambition, intoxicated by his own power and cunning, or was he a Faust or Prometheus, striving the impossibly difficult for the good of humanity? Schramm struggled to come up with a comprehensive evaluation of Mao. Schramm stated, I agree with the current Chinese perspective that Mao's virtues exceed his shortcomings, but quantifying the positive and negative parts is a challenging task. For example, how do you balance the hundreds of millions of peasants who were fortunate enough to obtain land against the millions who were executed during land reform and the campaign against counter-revolutionaries, or in other situations, where millions of people died, some of whom perhaps should have died, but others who most definitely did not? How can the economic progress made during the first 5-year plan, or the entire 27 years of Mao's rule after 1949, be balanced against the starvation that followed the Great Leap Forward's misguided enthusiasm or the Cultural Revolution's bloody debacle. Schramm continued, in the last analysis, however, I am more interested in the potential future impact of his thought than in sending Mao as an individual to heaven or to hell. Mao's legacy was evaluated by Maurice Meisner in Mao's China and After, A History of the People's Republic. Now, the events that have left the deepest mark on our political and historical consciousness are the blots on the Maoist record, particularly the Great Leap and the Cultural Revolution. It must and ought not to be forgotten that these adventures were massive failures that cost a great deal of human life. However they may evaluate it, historians in the future will undoubtedly record the Maoist era in the history of the People's Republic as one of the great modernizing epochs in global history, one that greatly benefited the Chinese people on a social and human level, despite its failures and crimes. Mao's actions had unavoidably proportionate effects given his extraordinary authority and the vast population he governed. His accomplishments as a modernizer and unifier were enormous, yet he made terrible mistakes that caused unimaginably great pain. Millions of Chinese people died as a result of his cruel tactics, idealistic ideals, ruthlessness, and will to triumph, which caused them to endure excruciating pain. Because he thought that suffering and death were inevitable in the pursuit of his cause, he was willing to bear enormous costs. For those who survived, Mao's revolution brought about economic growth, modernization, and education, foundations upon which later advancements were built. In addition, it brought China back together and established it as a global power. He made a lasting impression on history. Third World. Many communists, mostly in the Third World, have been affected by Maoism, including members of revolutionary groups like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Shining Path in Peru, and the revolutionary struggle in Nepal. Mao's agrarian socialism and the Cultural Revolution inspired Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to create the disastrous Year Zero policies that led to the genocide in Cambodia by purging the country of its intellectuals, artists, and teachers and emptying its cities. Marxism-Leninism-Maoism is also the declared doctrine of the Revolutionary Communist Party of the United States of America, as well as other communist parties affiliated with the Revolutionary Internationalist movement worldwide. Since Mao's passing, the Communist Party has drifted far away from Maoism, and the majority of foreign Maoists consider the Deng Xiaoping reforms to be a betrayal of Maoism, in keeping with Mao's perception of capitalist roaders in the movement. Less emphasis was placed on Mao's prestige as the Chinese government implemented market economic reforms beginning in the late 1970s and as other Chinese leaders came to power. This coincided with a fall in official acknowledgement of Mao in subsequent years, as opposed to prior years when the state hosted a number of ceremonies and conferences to mark Mao's centennial. However, the Chinese government has never formally rejected Mao's strategies. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were opposed by Deng Xiaoping, who said, "When we write about his mistakes we should not exaggerate, for otherwise we shall be discrediting Chairman Mao Zedong and this would mean discrediting our party and state." Mao first articulated the concept of two intermediate zones, in response to growing Chinese fears about a US-Soviet realignment against China following the July 1963 Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. According to Mao, Africa and Latin America constitute the first intermediate zone, where China's non-white status may allow it to rival and even surpass the influence of both the US and the USSR. The wealthy European allies of the United States formed the other intermediate zone. Military tactics. Both those looking to start an insurrection and those looking to put one down continue to draw heavily from Mao's military works, particularly in the area of guerrilla warfare, where Mao is still widely considered as a genius. Mao's ideas on protracted warfare, new democracy, popular support, the permanence of revolution, and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution had a significant impact on the Nepali Maoists. Mao's conception of the People's War, which combined guerrilla warfare and, more significantly, mobile warfare techniques, is his greatest contribution to military science. Despite the obvious superiority of UN firepower, Mao had effectively used mobile warfare to encircle, push back, and eventually halt the UN forces in Korea during the Korean War. and, in spite of the obvious superiority of UN weaponry, managed to encircle, push back, and eventually halt the UN forces in Korea. Additionally, Mao appeared to suggest in 1957 that he might even be in favor of nuclear conflict. Books. Both Chinese and non-Chinese people commonly quote Mao's poetry and literature. A well-known passage from one of Mao's poems was included in the official Chinese translation of President Barack Obama's inauguration speech. All of the People's Republic of China's new yuan money started to feature Mao's image in the middle of the 1990s. The official purpose of this measure was to prevent counterfeiting, since Mao's image is more recognizable than the generic images found on previous coinage. The People's Daily revealed on March 13, 2006, that a Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference member had suggested adding Sun Yat-sen and Deng Xiaoping's images on the renminbi. Public perception. Mao stated things about personality cults that were incongruous. Responding to the Khrushchev Report of 1956, which had criticized Joseph Stalin, Mao declared that personality cults are poisonous ideological survivals of the old society and reiterated China's commitment to collective leadership. When it came to personality cults, Mao stated that he was in favor of those that supported truly worthy individuals rather than those that engaged in blind worship during the 1958 Party Conference in Chengdu. In an effort to prepare the peasants to fend off the temptations of feudalism and the resurgent capitalism that Mao saw as a result of loose economic reforms, he suggested the Socialist Education Movement, SEM, in 1962. Mao occupied a central position in a vast amount of politically charged art that was created and distributed. Chairman Mao is the red sun in our hearts is a reference to Mao found on a number of posters, badges, and musical compositions. The Little Red Book, also referred to as Mao's quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, was released in October 1966. It was recommended that party members always have a copy on them, and having one was practically a requirement for joining. As stated by Mao. The Unknown Story by Jun Yang, whose widespread distribution and publication helped Mao become the sole millionaire in 1950s China. With time, Mao's picture appeared in nearly every place, including residences, workplaces, and retail establishments. Even in the most obscure publications, his citations were typographically emphasized by being placed in boldface or red letters. Childhood rhymes and music from the era both emphasized Mao's status. People would often hear the saying, "Long live Chairman Mao," for 10,000 years during that time. Throughout addition, Mao's image may be seen throughout Chinese and international popular culture, where it appears on everything from t-shirts to coffee cups. Kong Dongmei, Mao's granddaughter, justified the phenomenon by saying that it demonstrates his influence, that he exists in people's consciousness and has influenced the way of life of several generations of Chinese people. Similar to the image of Che Guevara, he has come to represent revolutionary culture. More than 40 million people have traveled to Shaoshan, Hunan, the birthplace of Mao, since 1950. According to a 2016 YouGov survey, 42% of millennial Americans were unaware of Mao. In 2019, only 21% of Australian millennials knew who Mao Zedong was, according to a CIS study. In 2020's China, with growing social inequality, long work hours, and dwindling economic prospects, Generation Z is adopting Mao's revolutionary beliefs, including violence against the capitalist class. Personal life. During his reign, Mao maintained extreme secrecy about his personal life. The Private Life of Chairman Mao, a biography written by Mao's personal physician Li Jisui, was released following his death. It includes details about Mao's personal life, including his numerous sexual partners, addiction to strong sleeping drugs, and chain smoking of cigarettes. The veracity of these narratives and portrayals has been contested by certain academics as well as people who had first-hand knowledge of Mao. Mao had a distinct Hunanese accent when speaking Mandarin because he was raised in Hunan. A strong Hunanese dialect, earthy remarks on sexual matters, and pride in his peasant ways and manners were among the traits that Claire Hollingworth characterized in Mao, while Ross Terrell described him as a son of the soil, rural and unsophisticated in beginnings. Mao's earthiness meant, according to Li Fagan, that he remained a part of everyday Chinese life. Stuart R. Schramm, a sinologist, emphasized Mao's brutality while also pointing out that he showed no signs of enjoying torture or murder in the name of revolution. Although Li Fagan believed that Mao was not the kind of villain that his mentor Stalin was, he was draconian and authoritarian when faced with threats. Mao, according to Alexander Pantsov and Stephen I. Levine, was neither a saint nor a demon, but rather a man of complex moods who tried his best to bring about prosperity and gain international respect for China. He passionately desired fame and power and aspired to be a strong, willful, and purposeful hero, not bound by any moral chains. In his early years, they said, Mao picked up some English, thanks in part to Zhang Hanji, his English instructor, interpreter, and diplomat who went on to marry China's foreign minister and head of the country's UN delegation, Xiao Guanhua. He could only say a few single words, small phrases, and sentences in spoken English. In the 1950s, he made the highly rare decision to begin studying English methodically, as at that time, Russian was the primary foreign language taught in Chinese schools. Penmanship and calligraphy. Mao wrote a great deal of philosophy and political literature. The selected works of Mao Zedong, released in 4 volumes by the People's Publishing House since 1951, is the primary collection of his pre-1949 writings. A 5th volume, which completed the chronology to 1957, was briefly published under Hua Guofeng's leadership before being taken out of print due to what were deemed to be ideological inaccuracies. An official, complete works of Mao Zedong, compiling all of his known works, has never been released. Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, also known as the Red Treasure Book, in Cultural Revolution China, and the Little Red Book, in the West, are credited to Mao. This collection of brief excerpts from his numerous speeches and articles, the majority of which can be found in the selected works, was first published in January 1964. Lin Biao edited it and arranged the pieces in a topical manner. Some of Mao's most well-known quotations can be found in the Little Red Book. Both before and after he came to power, Mao published a great deal on philosophy, commentary, and political strategy. Mao had a very distinctive calligraphy style and was a proficient Chinese calligrapher. During his lifetime, Mao was regarded as a master calligrapher in China. You can still see his calligraphy all over mainland China. Since his passing, the Mao style, or Maodi, a new style of Chinese calligraphy, has grown in popularity thanks to his contributions. There are several competitions that focus on calligraphy in the Mao style. Literary compositions. Mao's schooling started with Chinese classical literature, just like the majority of intellectuals in his period in China. In 1936, Mao told Edgar Snow that although he had begun studying the 4 works and the Confucian Analects at an elementary school when he was 8 years old, the works he loved to read the most were Dream of the Red Chamber, Journey to the West, Water Margin, and The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. From his early years, Mao produced poems in traditional formats, and his poetic prowess enhanced his reputation in China following his ascent to power in 1949. The renowned poets Li Bai and Li He of the Tang dynasty had an impact on his style. Changsha, 1925, The Double Ninth, October 1929, Lushan Pass, 1935, The Long March, 1935, Snow, February 1936, The PLA Captures Nanjing, 1949, Reply to Li Shi, May 11, 1957, and Ode to the Plum Blossom, December 1961, are a few of his nationally recognized poetry. Portrayal in television and movies. Mao has frequently appeared in television and movies. Among the well-known performers are Han Shi, who played Mao for the first time in 2 different films, 1978's Dailianhua and 1980's Cross the Dada River, Gu Yu, who played Mao 84 times in his 27-year career and was named Best Actor at the 100 Flowers Awards in 1990 and 1993. Lu Yi, who portrayed Mao at a younger age in The Founding of a Party, 2011, Tang Guoqiang, who has portrayed Mao more recently in a number of films and television shows, including The Long March, 1996, The Founding of a Republic, 2009, and Huang Yanpei, 2010. Nixon in China, 1987, an opera by American composer John Adams, features Mao as a major character. The phrase, "But if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to make it with anyone anyhow," in the Beatles' song Revolution alludes to Mao. When the line was added in 1972, John Lennon expressed sorrow. Thank you for taking the time to engage with our content. We're delighted you enjoyed this article and would love to hear your feedback. Your feedback is really valuable to us, so please share it in the comments box below. If you're new and want to remain up to date on our latest material, subscribe to the Up First Time channel. By subscribing, you will be the first to learn about our new stories and videos, ensuring that you never miss out on any of the excitement. But we're more than just distributing material, we're also about creating a community. That is why we value your feedback so highly. If you have any recommendations or themes you'd like us to look into more, please leave them in the comments. We're always looking for new ideas and eager to hear from our viewers. And, speaking of ideas, if you're as enthusiastic about this subject or person as we are, have you considered doing a whole documentary? Your unique thoughts and viewpoints could be extremely beneficial to others, and presenting them in a documentary style could help you reach an even larger audience. This is something to think about. Finally, remember to click the like button and share this video with your friends and family. Let's work together to expand our community and welcome new members to the Up First Time family. Your support is invaluable to us, and we could not do it without you. Thank you again for your support, and we look forward to continuing this great journey with you.